Donkey Kong was a massive franchise in Nintendo back in the early 2000s, with a successful trilogy on the Super Nintendo, and arguably one of the biggest games on the Nintendo 64. He was definitely on top of Nintendo's list alongside with Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon, and that's all thanks to its creator of the series, Rareware. Rare were the main developers of the Donkey Kong games for over the years now, creating hit after hit, massive success, and arguably one of the best platformers ever made with Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest. And even beyond Donkey Kong, they just kept making hit after hit, like Perfect Dark, Conker's Bad Fur Day, GoldenEye, and stuff like this. And you can say how much you want of how they're dated, but they did leave a lasting impression. But starting with the brand new century, Nintendo was preparing for their next-gen console, the Nintendo GameCube. So it was pretty much a no-brainer that Rare would bring their A game to the very new console with a brand new Donkey Kong game called Donkey Kong Racing. I mean, the GameCube was pretty much the prime time for most Nintendo series at the time, as we got cult classic back after back after back. Unfortunately, if you're a Nintendo fan, this news is probably very familiar. Rare only released one ever game on the Nintendo GameCube, which so happens to be Star Fox Adventure. That's because in 2002, they were sold to Xbox. Microsoft was known for buying out a lot of studios over the years, especially even today. I mean, hell, they just bought Activision and now own Crash Bandicoot and Spyro, which is still weird to think about. But this was their first ever big buyouts for a game studio, and it so happens to be one of the most infamous acquisitions of all time period, that affected a lot of franchises over the years, especially with Donkey Kong. And still to this very day, people never really understood why Nintendo just didn't buy Rare full out, since they were pretty much a prominent studio for the Super Nintendo and especially the N64. Then again, a lot of times, Nintendo rarely buys out studios a lot of times, and sometimes when they do, it makes you question, they don't own it already? Like a game studio like SRD, for example, who's been working with Nintendo since Donkey Kong in the arcade, and they just now in 2022 buy the company. This is just Nintendo's shtick, they're very unpredictable. And I know people mostly blame Xbox for the whole Rare buyout thing, but honestly I feel like Nintendo is at fault as well, because they should have bought the rest of Rare so they didn't have an open buyer like this. And so, without Rare, Donkey Kong pretty much had no developer who could work on any Donkey Kong games. And sadly, just like any other franchise like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro, Nintendo just had no idea what to do with Donkey Kong around the time, so they pretty much worked with other studios and see what sticked. One of the prominent ones being Namco, as they created 3 Donkey Kong games during the GameCube's life under a brand new spin-off series. Donkey Konga are other games similar to their Taiko series, where you pretty much jam through music both Nintendo-based and licensed. With the main gimmick of the game, and the thing that Donkey Kong was pretty much tied to for years, were the Donkey Kong Bongos. And when I mean tied to, I mean this peripheral was pretty much super glued to Donkey Kong through an entire console generation. It's basically a giant bongo controller. And honestly, Nintendo released this during the right time, because around the early 2000s, Guitar Heroes was all the rage around the time with the giant plastic peripheral kits and such. It was definitely a dumb gimmick, but it was still pretty fun, especially during my sleepovers at my cousin's place. And as for Donkey Konga itself, well... So in this game, there's actually a story mode, surprisingly, where Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong are walking through the beach where they discover a set of bongos, although Donkey Kong for some reason has no idea what they are, even though in the last game he used bongos as a weapon. Besides Metroid and Kirby, Nintendo just does not care about continuity whatsoever for the most part. In this game, it's pretty much a simple rhythm game, and I mean a really simple rhythm game. You hit the bongo left and right with the microphone that you can clap into, and it works, but I don't know, there's nothing really that noteworthy about this game. It's just a simple Taiko game with Donkey Kong in it. There's no spectacle or anything quirky like Parappa the Rapper. There are minigames you can unlock in this game, but unfortunately I couldn't unlock any of them, because in order to get the other ones, you need to grind through the main campaign. I could only get about 10 or 30 coins per round, but for the prices to get the minigames, they're asking you to get around 5,000 coins. And my arms just cannot withstand doing that constantly back and forth just to get footage for these kinds of minigames. While at least the music selection in this game is pretty solid for the most part, They added a lot of interesting licensed songs and a lot of cool remixes of Nintendo themes. They're pretty much what you expect, like a remix of Mario 1 and the remix of Legend of Zelda. They even included the opening theme songs for the Kirby and Pokemon animes. The only thing I find baffling about the song list are the lack of Donkey Kong soundtracks, because the only one we've got here is the remix version of the DK rap from Super Smash Bros. Melee, which is notorious to be the inferior version. Donkey Konga is a perfectly fine game, but it is definitely probably the most average Nintendo game I think I've ever played. But from what I've seen, the game is sold decently well to get a couple more games, which isn't really surprising because once again, this was around the time when stuff like this was all the rage. And so, we've got Donkey Konga 2, and it's literally the same game. Like, I'm not kidding, this is literally identical to the previous one, except for a brand new song list. And since this is the North American version, our song list is completely different from the other regions because they leaned way more to mostly just licensed music. And because of this, they inadvertently made the first and only ever T-rated Donkey Kong game. But you can play All-Star Smash Mouth in this game, so this is immediately a 10 out of 10 game. I wish I could say more about this game, but really, I can't. It's literally just the second game with worse content and worse song list. This is literally the most bare-bones Nintendo game I think I've ever played. And the kicker of all of this is that Donkey Konga barely released in America in the first place. Because in a recent interview last year, Reiji's Fils-aimé stated that he did not like Donkey Konga at all, and was preventing Nintendo from releasing it in the first place. He disgruntledly eventually agreed, but he did not like the final project anyway. And believe it or not, there was even a third Donkey Konga game, but that was only released in Japan, so I can't talk about it. And so... well, this is not really a good start for the video. While Donkey Kong wasn't really doing that well with the home console stuff, he was doing a lot better with the handhelds. As I mentioned in my other Donkey Kong videos, while WARE was owned by Microsoft, they were still able to make a lot of GBA titles and even work on Donkey Kong still. Even though they had to cancel Donkey Kong Racing, they were still able to recycle a lot of their other Donkey Kong projects as well. There was a game called Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers, which was remade into It's Mr. Pants. And Diddy Kong Pilot, which was supposed to be a spiritual successor to Diddy Kong Racing, was converted into a Banjo spinoff. But despite reconstructing these things into non-Donkey Kong stuff, they were still able to make big projects with Donkey Kong, as they made full-on remix of the entire Donkey Kong trilogy from the ground up. Even though the presentation was a bit more shoddy, they added a lot of new content into this game, and a lot of quality of life improvements like being able to save freely. Which honestly makes the GBA version on equal ground with the original, since these two versions both have pros and cons for each of them. But Rare wasn't the only developer for Donkey Kong on the GBA, because there was one more as well. That's when Payon comes into the mix. Now this studio is pretty much one of those contractor studios that you would see in a couple games during the Wii days. I did talk about these guys years ago when I was doing my Klonoa video because they were the developers for the Klonoa Wii remake. But before they made a game about this adorable little cat thing, they were making Donkey Kong games with Nintendo, with the first game releasing on the GBA called DK King of Swings. Now this game is a somewhat spiritual successor to a really niche Nintendo game called Clu Clu Land, where you swing around these little peg things around the area. And that is pretty much the case for this game in particular. But before we start the game, there's also an interesting thing about this one, as this is the first ever Donkey Kong game to have a completely new art style, as the pre-rendered graphics that Donkey Kong was famous for was replaced with a hand-drawn style. And frankly, it's not too shabby. I'm kind of digging how everyone looks. And as for the gameplay, well, it's alright. So the main gimmick is that Donkey Kong can grab onto these little pegboards and swing across levels, with L and R controlling each of Donkey Kong's hands so he can grab on each pegs. To jump around, you will need to hold down the L and R button to charge Donkey Kong into a big jump that he can even take down enemies. There are bananas everywhere, and they were used to refill your health every time you collect 10 of the fruit. Everything about this game is pretty solid, however there's just one big thing that's preventing me from really enjoying this game, which is its pacing. Because this game feels very slow as shit, and Donkey Kong just feels way too floaty to have fun. I never really feel like I have full control on Donkey Kong, which is very apparent with this level in particular, where you're gliding on top of a tornado. And the most annoying part is that it's one of those levels where the wind pushes Donkey Kong to the left, and I feel like I'm not in full control, which leads to me going all the way back down in the beginning. Honestly, I say try this game out, but it is more of an acquired taste than anything. But Payon wouldn't really be done with this gameplay style because with the release of the Nintendo DS, they made a sequel. DK Jungle Climber. It's basically King of Swing, but way better. So the story in this game is that Donkey Kong and his family are having a nice day at the beach when suddenly they notice a giant banana on the mountaintops. And once they go investigate the area, they find K. Rool stealing the banana crystal that he uses to go into another dimension. And now there's aliens in Donkey Kong, as we need to help the talking banana stop K. Rool for one final time. And yes, I said one final time because this is the last time that K. Rool was a main villain in a Donkey Kong game. Nintendo, for the love of Christ, bring back the Kremlings. But anyway, so for the gameplay. It's pretty much exactly like King of Swings, but a lot better. Like, holy shit, the difference between the last one and this one is night and day. Donkey Kong controls way better in this game, and the levels are a lot more expansive and way more interesting than the previous one. And instead of that terrible charging move to jump very far, all you have to do is just press B and Donkey Kong just goes flying in the air, which feels a lot more fun and more natural. Which is very useful because they even add a lot more Donkey Kong elements into this game. Like the trademark collectibles like the Kong letters and the DK coin from Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3. Making this one in particular feel like the most Donkey Kong game out of anything in this video. You can even find Diddy Kong in a barrel, and he acts like an additional hit point just like the Donkey Kong Country games as well. And it even has its own attribute because if you jump in the air, you can fling Diddy Kong around, getting a lot more collectibles more than ever. They even add interesting new ideas to the level scene to make things a lot more interesting, like grabbing onto this giant sunflower to fling in the air like a slingshot. And one of the cooler ideas for a level design is this little puzzle room, where Donkey Kong needs to figure out which of the panels are real, and the only way to do so is if the panels line up with its reflection. And of course, since this is a Nintendo DS game, there's also a lot of minigames as well, with the main one being the bonus areas, where you start things off with a small roulette of which size barrel you'll be grabbing, and you're pretty much using the barrel to catch as many bananas as you can. I'll be damned, I was honestly caught off guard by this, but this is honestly a really good Donkey Kong game. Dare I say, probably one of the most underrated Donkey Kong games as well. If you're a big fan of DK, I highly recommend trying it out, it's a great game. Alright, so Payon proved themselves they are pretty capable of making decent to great Donkey Kong games. So do you think with how good they were doing for the handheld scene, they would do good for the home console scene as well? So in 2007, Nintendo and Payon collabed for another Donkey Kong game. This time being on the Nintendo GameCube, which uses the DK Bongos, since Donkey Kong was pretty much obligated to use the Bongos for the entirety of the GameCube. This time this game is going to be a racing game which uses Bongo jetpacks as the vehicle. However, as the development went by, the GameCube was officially discontinued, so the game was converted into a Wii title. Instead of the trademark bongos that the game was worked around, it was replaced with the Wii Remote and Nunchuck. And with this result, we ended up with arguably one of the worst Nintendo games ever made. Donkey Kong just couldn't catch a break around this time. So in Donkey Kong Barrel Blast, it's a racing game, so what is the point of a racing game? To go fast. But in order to go fast, you need to shake the Wii Remote and Nunchuck really fast so the player can go into max speed. Keep in mind, this is an early Wii title, so that means you are aggressively shaking that damn thing. If you want to turn left and right, you have to shake either the Wii Remote or Nunchuck to turn. The theme of this game is Kongs vs. Kremlings, and with that, they all have their unique items depending on the color balloons they have. The game does have this interesting feature where bananas are everywhere, and as you collect them, you can fill up this gauge. Once the thing is filled, you can do a little boost, but not only that, but if you strategically do it right, as every time you boost into a barrel or an opponent, your boost will last a lot longer. Which unironically does give this game a bit more interesting strategy to it, so I'll give them that. As you explore the areas, you can also launch yourself out of cannons and such, trying to get into the lead. Although sometimes they'll put you in a little QTE where you'll get a bunch of bananas as well. In the underwater tracks, you can also find On Guard, which allows you to ride really fast, which is honestly a really nice surprise. The problem with this game, however, and why people do not like this game at all, is the Waggle Fest I mentioned earlier. Because keep in mind, you're aggressively shaking left and right in a fast-paced racing game a lot. Even within 20 minutes, I was pretty much drained with playing through the game. This game was clearly made for the Bongos in mind, and the Wii remotes were not really a good substitute for it. Which leads to pretty much the worst racing game I think I've ever played from a Nintendo. I would rather play Super Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo because while that game aged very badly, at least I can control in that game. I've played a lot of Wii games over the years, and never in my days have I felt so exhausted of playing a Wii game. And honestly, that's a real shame because I do see a somewhat good potential of this game if Payon can expand it upon and flesh it out for a sequel or something. But alas, this was the final game that Payon has ever made for Donkey Kong. I mean, come on Nintendo, you've superglued the monkey into a plastic novelty Bongos for an entire console lifespan, and this is what you could do with it? What? Okay, hold on. Hello? Yeah? There's another Donkey Kong Bongo game on GameCube? And it's a platformer? Alright, so for the longest time, I've heard about this Donkey Kong game in particular on GameCube called Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, which is a side-scroller platformer, which is how I learned about the DK Bongos in the first place, and all I could think of is that, how? How do you make a 2D platformer for a Bongo controller? What also makes this game even weirder is that it's also set in its own continuity where Donkey Kong is the only one in this game. Yes, no K. Rool, no Cranky, not even Diddy Kong, it's just Donkey Kong, which is kind of interesting. And as we start the game, we're immediately into the gameplay, and this surprisingly controls really well. I was honestly off-putted about this game using the Bongo control scheme, but the more you play it, the more how fun and natural it feels. The game is very fast-paced and very arcadic, where the main goal in this game is to collect as many bananas as you can to tally up this cool little meter. In order to grab the bananas, you have to clap repeatedly to grab all the bananas and do a little combo. The more you do well with the combo, the more additional bananas you can get. Not only that, but also this game reminds me a lot of Rayman, where it's just very fun just to go with the flow. Everything just feels very bombastic and very fun. Levels just ooze with unique charm and unique ideas left and right. There's multiple kingdoms you go through with 2 levels in each with an additional boss fight. The bananas you collect throughout the 2 levels are used as the health meter for the boss, ending things off with this tally meter that's, again, just like Rayman. And another thing is that this game looks freaking amazing for the GameCube. Donkey Kong is very expressive, and every time he punches in the air, it feels very impactful. And you also notice a lot of familiar elements in this game because the developers for this game eventually went on to make Mario Galaxy, one of the most acclaimed Mario games of all time period. I'll be honest, I really want to go back to playing this game because it is just so fun to go through. And if you can really afford the GameCube version, I recommend trying out the new Play controls as well, which not only refines the control scheme to make things a lot more traditional, but it's also in widescreen as well. There was a lot of growing pains in this video, but at least we end things off with a good note with Jungle Beat. And those were the Donkey Kong games during the 2000s, and overall, out of the 6 games that Donkey Kong had in this decade, I only enjoyed 2 of them. Literally 1/3 of the entire catalog that decade. So, Donkey Kong fans weren't really that pleased with Nintendo around that time. But luckily, at the end of the day, it would be all worth it around 2010, when Nintendo collabed with Retro Studios to revive Donkey Kong for a brand new generation. Now, this not necessarily saved Donkey Kong in general, because even still to this day, Nintendo still mishandles Donkey Kong, but it was still a great glimmer of hope for the future of Donkey Kong at the time. I'll return to Donkey Kong next year. As for now, I would like to say Happy New Year's and let's hope for a good old 2024. But that'll do it for today, so thank you for watching and I'll see you later. Bye bye!